Kaveny is a distinguished member of both theology and the law school. She did her undergraduate work at Princeton, and she has both a JD and a PhD from Yale. She got a JD, and then I told her she paid the theology for the money. Heather has a BA from Harvard College and a PhD from Harvard University and studied with one of the great stars. So I have 5 questions. This is just to get things going. And then I would say at 6:30, does that work for you?
So we got history, political science, theology,
Law on the back.
Law on the back, high lawyer.
So I guess our first question for the two of you is, how do you conceive of the relationship between being an academic and being a public intellectual? I mean, do you think they're conjoined? I mean, did you back into one or the other, or did your work in the academy lead you to public, or was it the other way around?
Oh, I think you could start. No, I'm good.
I can start. No.
I suppose it was really the academic was first, right? You know, you go to graduate school and you get interested in the things that that you're reading about, you're writing about, you get, passionate about them, and then you read something that really ticks you off. Or it gets it wrong in some way. For me, it was that, that people had a misunderstanding about Catholic moral theology or about the way law worked, and I felt like I needed to kind of address it. So I see the root is really in my academic commitment, and what I see I'm doing if I am a public intellectual is really kind of more of an extension of teaching, right? You're trying to explain something, you're trying to empower people by giving them a broader context.
And I would say exactly that. I teach. And I teach in any number of different contexts, and it just happens that some of them tend to be very public, but the skill set is exactly the same, and the role is exactly the same.
So did you, this is not one of the questions I sent you, but I'm sure the first unfair question. What's the hardest forum you had to speak? So I know you've been on a number of TV things. Heather has a famous blog.
You mean speak for a write-in? I mean,
You aren't cold here.
no, John Stewart. That was fun. That was really fun, but that was very nerve-wracking. You're just terrified. I think I had an out-of-body experience when this kind of stuff. But the hardest thing I ever had to do that's been really good for transferable skills is write an 800-word column. Like when I first turned in my first column, I think it was 1,200 words, and they said, Kathy, when we said 800 words, we meant 800 words. And so to have to really say, what's the important thing I'm trying to communicate here? What are the essential kind of elements of this? That discipline, I think, is still hard, and I think it still benefits.
So the non-field lessons explain about your column.
Oh, okay, so for Commonweal is a progressive Catholic magazine, and around 2003, 2004, they said, do you want to do a column for us? So I've been doing kind of a column maybe 4 to 6 times a year for them for about, I guess I don't want to think about how long now, 17 years, yeah. And so kind of keeping things clear, but also brief is hard. You have to decide what you can leave out.
My hardest audience ever was I was asked to advise a very senior politician, and a room was full of very senior politicians. And I was a nervous wreck. But it went fine. That was probably the hardest, but the second hardest is one that's of significance here to you all, and that was I was a graduate student and was asked to do a presentation in front of a very well-known professor who was horrible to me. He was trying desperately to humiliate me, and I literally, even as a first-year graduate student, I'm like, really? If you are so insecure you have to throw your weight around with a first-year graduate student, the issue is not me, it's you. But I tried to do it to my graduate students, and that's one of the reasons why it was scarring, and nobody stood up for me. So
was this in a class or?
He was a visitor to the classroom and I was supposed to present his work and he did not do that good job. Because nobody could.
Unfortunately, that's not a unique experience at Harvard University.
Yes, that's right. But it's one that I think is educational.
So how many times a week do you do your letters on the line?
7. I gotta tell you, that's the one thing that makes me angry is when people say to me, she writes almost every night. I'm like, no, I write every night.
So what's your
I watch the news all day, and I talk to people all day. And then I start to write as soon as I possibly can when I finish my day job. So I will go home tonight immediately and start writing. And if I know exactly what I'm going to say, I can do it in 2 hours. Well, if it's off the top of my head. But if I don't particularly, which is why sometimes because I would work on what last time. Yeah. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And somebody asked me about, what I thought of the proliferation of newsletters and whether or not they would continue. And I said, I think that like blogging, remember everybody blogged, it's so much. I mean, I'm at a place where obviously I will continue because how can I not? And there's many wonderful things about it I'm happy to share, but it's a lot of work.
So how do you triage? I mean, I know as a former dean, you open up your email and there's a couple hundred emails. How do you triage who you answer? Like, is it balance between students and people responding to your column or your blog, or how do you decide who to answer and who not to answer?
Do you mean if somebody writes me an email about what I've written? I'll usually, if it's an honest question, I will answer it if I can. If somebody says, please explain to me the entire background of, there's a committee about Biden and communion, about giving Biden communion in the context of the whole, I'm sorry, I can't do that. That's beyond my capacity at this point. I'll point them in the direction of a couple of books. If it's an honest question, I'll answer it. If it's really just nasty, like, you're going to hell, blah, blah, I just delete it. Keeping it.
I always print those out and put them in a folder called Good Friday. You usually do that.
You don't say, I'll send you a secret flyer.
I could say that, but then they write back and they just go away.
So what do you do when you're triage?
I have 3 separate emails. I always answer students on my VC email. And I have one email I just can't even look at. I have a full-time assistant who does nothing for me email. And he forwards to me basically things I would like to answer. And otherwise I did nothing to do that so far today. I've done nothing to answer one call. Just because of it all. That was the important stuff to answer. How many do I get? Well, I currently have over 100,000 on red. So that's a 1-year-old server? I don't have my own server, no, but I do have several different email accounts. And it depends. If I write something, I wrote something and I didn't read any of them because I just can't. My assistant said he got that day over 1,500 emails on that, and his the time he was working. So I don't know, it's crazy. And I wish I could do better. I remember when people used to say, well, I never answer my email and people write to me. I would love to answer their offers and offers. It would be a full-time job just to answer the substantive ones, let alone actually the ones that say, explain to me why the community, which is like,
Explain the civil war.
Or you're wrong about it. Sometimes people want to make corrections that are a little bit nonsensical. As in, I see that somebody wrote something about you 8 years ago. I think they issued that. It's like, take it.
You feel comfortable being called public intellectual. And if you you sort of explain why, or if not public intellectuals, what's a better phrase?
That's a good question. I don't mind being called a public intellectual. I mean, to the extent that you speak in public and you try to offer reflections from your learning, I think you are. I mean, I suppose what I don't want to, the distinction I want to make is between doing what I do, which is one thing, and doing what journalists do, or just op-ed writers for newspapers on the other. Not that they're just, I mean, some of the smartest people I know are, are opinion writers for New York Times or the Post or something like that. I have the greatest respect for them. But what I think my value added is, I've got the luxury of the time to really have a broader perspective on some of these things, and I only intervene in a debate if I think I can offer something that's useful. To just do what a journalist does with PhD after my name doesn't seem to make much sense to me. So it's, do I have something I can contribute from what I have and what I'm learning and want to learn. And so that's how I think of a public intellectual, not somebody that's just, remember Nightline a long time ago with Ted Koppel? And I used to say, so many people just want to get on Nightline and say, well, Ted, here's what I'm thinking. But I don't think that that's what our role is as people who are scholars who are trying to intervene in public debates. It's not just discuss.
I think that's public intellectual. I think of some old guy sort of thinking great thoughts or at least sharing great thoughts. I think there's a job description as opposed to doing something, which may be completely unfair. So I don't think people comment that, but I don't think of myself that way at all. I think of myself as a teacher or as a historian. And I think of myself as a historian. That I'm kind of trying to call the balls and strikes. And in this moment, the other thing that's really interesting about it was that, again, when I think of public intellectuals, I think it's, and again, I'm perhaps being unfair, I just think of it as, say, a job description. I think of writing to major papers and all that. I've certainly done that. But it's a really different enterprise than interviewing in the public role that I currently am. And that's a reflection, I think, not of me, but of this moment. When the gatekeepers are changing, the technology is changing, the jobs are changing, everything is changing, and certain people are riding that in new ways. And so I'm doing it, writing letters, but think of the people on TikTok who are really changing things, or Instagram, huge Instagram followers, people who are, would you call, well, not necessarily, some of them, Steve Vladeck was doing and Neil Kochel were doing really short explainers for the law on, I think it was either Instagram or Twitter this summer, and really fabulous stuff. And if you think about Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the next word out of your mouth is probably not going to be TikTok.
Right.
And yet, are the people on TikTok public intellectuals? I guess they are, but to me they don't really fit the job description that sitting in front of the library saying, yes, well, I think that this is what you said.
So at what point, when you were a graduate, did you see yourself teaching outside the academy or not? Is what you currently do, you spend a lot of your time, writing columns, answering questions from columns, reporters and things like that. Did you see that as what you were doing when you were a grad student?
You asking me?
I was thinking when I was a graduate student, I'm like, please just let me graduate. I was not going, let's see what I'm going to play on this board.
No, it didn't. It just sort of grew up organically. I mean, I think part of the thing is, I think the very first thing I ever wrote that was public was, might have been 203 for Commonweal, was on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Because I was watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and I liked it. I saw a lot of religious themes in it. So I just wrote this piece and sent it in, and then they liked it, and then I did one on Will and Grace, and then I did another one on The Sopranos, and so it was just, I tried to get my dean to buy me a big screen TV as a business expense that didn't go anywhere. doing things that you like and then it kind of rolls along.
You said you're wrong, so.
I really want to do something on, the new pope and the young pope as kind of images of religion. So I tend to like to do things like that, but then actually the column kind of cut down on that because the column is inexorable, nothing like what you do, every night, but you think, oh God, I've got to write a column. I can't spend a day sort of, thinking about, something that's going to be more long form because my priorities really are the teaching and my academic writing. I do a lot of stuff for things that nobody actually watches because they're at a conference or something. So you have to fit this piece in, and I have no idea how you do it. It's amazing.
Well, I do think that part of being in the world is literally being in the world. So, we talked about what the vampires there. I think the first public thing in that vein that I did, although I certainly, my fantasy is to be in a basement writing books by myself, which is ironic, but I started working for a children's magazine, which everybody thought was like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, it's interesting. And it started the process of learning to write really clearly. And, having children on my own and, being out in the world as opposed to staying in the academy, I think it's the best thing that ever happened to me because I remember, and I hope many of you have never heard this, and I don't have never heard this, but I heard as people our age did that you could have 10-year children but not both. And I was like, well, I kind of want kids. So having children, and people say to me now, when am I going to fit it in? I'm like, I don't care when you fit it in, but if you want, you should fit it in because the process of explaining to your children or your neighbors or your whomever why what you're doing is important is how you figure out how to write. So one of the reasons I teach everyone says, why did you put your child in the museum? I'm like, first of all, that's what I care about, because you can't write unless you can teach. Because that's where you sit there and say, wait a minute, what really matters about the American Revolution is this, not let me go through every piece of the American Revolution. So, so for me, for the children's magazine, it's funny, I was just thinking I kept doing it once a year from then on. That was a great thing. She was doing it this year. I'm writing for her again, I don't know when, but I've done it for years.
You could explain sedition to children.
Actually, there's a long story that maybe is too long for now, but I got on the professor watch list early on, and the reason for that was because he got my name from somebody who put me on, I think, and I haven't chatted with him about it, but this is before I saw his name, who had put me on, they called it a time list, but it was theory about getting a job taken. Like this was before I was here, because of something I wrote in children's magazine about Lincoln and the Constitution, and somebody took exception to that and put me on it. Like I say, it's called a term it sounds worse than I think it was. But anyway, when Charlie Kirk needed to have a list of people, and you can see he's like, she looks good, and that's how I think that's how I ended up on the list.
So how far into your life as an academic did you left? The first academic class was in Southampton University of Notre Dame. How far into your academic career was it as an assistant professor that you said, I have to expand my oeuvre beyond publishing and referee journalists and giving talks at the AAR or whatever? How far into that time did you start saying, I'm going to start doing public things?
It's not like I made a career decision, right? It's not like I said, I'm going to be a public intellectual and, whatever that is with all the caveats and then, kind of had a 5-year plan to achieve it or something. It was much more people asked me to do things and I found it enjoyable in a way that teaching is wonderful, research is wonderful, but trying to communicate in this way, stretched a different set of intellectual muscles because, it was both teaching, but it was also impersonal in a sense. You had to try to frame it in a way that, would reach people that you didn't know. So you had to think, well, what can people assume? Or what can I assume about what people know? What do I need to explain to them? where do I say, well, this isn't about that, but if you wanna look at something else, here's where to go. So I think it just sort of developed organically, and tried to do, something else. And I was grateful. I mean, I'm delighted to be at Boston College. I think Boston College is wonderful. But I'm still grateful to Notre Dame for even being on tenure track as a law professor. They gave me the freedom to do that. Nobody said, oh, well, you shouldn't be doing that. You're talking about television. How can a law professor talk about television and coffee and coffee? So I'm grateful because you need the support of context.
Yes, exactly right. I agree that you just sort of go with people asking you, because once people start asking you to do things, then your name's on their list. So that's sort of how I got into doing this. But then I was denied tenure at my first job and sort of left the academy for a while. And in the process of that, I ended up learning a lot about teaching. I taught teachers and consultants, and I wrote a lot. And it opened up a whole new world, of communication and other jobs and all kinds of different ways of communicating. And so that was really instrumental for me. And I guess I never received any thought this was something I wanted when I was a student. But it's not entirely a surprise, I suspect, that I took those skills with me back in the
So what are the benefits of your, having this dual focus sounds really creative, interesting. You're teaching in two different situations, two different contexts. What do you gain from that, and what's the drawbacks of really addressing the academy and then addressing a larger world where you can't use academic speak? I don't know what it's like in history, but theology, there's a lot of theology speak. You have to shed
we
that.
don't do that at all. I think for me, I have never had a more intellectually vibrant period in my life, ever. Because there is constantly material coming at me from every place. And if you read me, you will see that I take forays now into foreign affairs. I am learning from that like in a first year undergraduate, because literally I will get something that says, did you see what happened in Belarus? And I'll be like, or Yemen. I wrote a piece on Yemen, and I was like, somebody else sparked that, and that took probably 14 hours. But I'm like, this is great. Why is nobody ever talking the history of Yemen right now? So there's that coming at me, but there's also the other, the academic side, where you need to actually look things up, figure out how things are done, and I have that skill set. But those two things are coming together, and that constant production of 1,200 words a day means that I'm actually becoming a good writer, which is, I thought I was a good writer 2 years ago. You sit down every day for 365 days a year and write 1,200 words, you turn into a book. And so that's the positive side. The downside is it's very tiring. It's a lot of work. With that being said, I always wanted to be a good writer. I always wanted to think things, and I always wanted to interview people in this world, and I get to do it. So it's worth what I thought it was.
Or not mornings, yeah. Not worth for me. The problem for me is, and maybe this is just this phase, I feel like I'm really scattered in the different things, I'm doing, but that's both in my professional life and my personal life. So, I did a talk on regulatory capture, and then there's this. Then I've got to do a talk on the crisis in the judiciary, and then I've got to do a talk on the recent papal teaching on bioethics, and so you're constantly moving from thing to thing, and sometimes it would be nice to sort of linger. And I suppose what I developed, not just because out of grad school, but actually for me, more out of law school, and practicing law. So I practiced law for 3 years with a healthcare firm, Ropes and Gray in Boston, before I even went into the academy. And that taught me a lot about writing and organizing quickly, because they just got no time for the, for the kind of abstract and you know, circuitous methods of presenting things, and that carried over both to my academic writing, I think, and also to my public intellectual life. But what I miss is the chance to really say, okay, here are 17 books on one thing, and I'm going to read all 17 of them, and I'll talk to you when I'm done.
It definitely would be nice to have a period to slow down and think, and not simply be reactive, but actually be active.
Would you, last question, then we'll turn to the, would you encourage your graduate students to do this double focus, academic life, public intellectual life? Is it something you think that's worthwhile that graduate students should entertain?
I guess I think grad students in grad school should use this time to really absorb what they can about, you know, about the field they're studying. You're never going to have another period of time which is really going to form the foundation for the rest of your intellectual life. It's the base. So I sometimes worry when grad students are so concerned for making a name outside the academy, or even for publishing within the academy, that they lose the main chance they have to just build out the foundation that they're going to draw on. And I've drawn on my graduate school training, even the most boring parts of it, in pretty much many of the other things.
Boring parts of it.
Oh, you know, once in a while.
Wasn't your history class?
Never. I had to teach myself history later for one of the books I wrote. I didn't get enough history. That was the problem.
It's the problem that everybody suffers when they don't.
I agree. It's true. That's why I've got friends who are historians, you know, so they kind of say, now what do I need to read here, Mark? Like, what was that? What was that war? Was that war? Or was that war?
Would you encourage this? Would you encourage this?
Well, so see, you bring up a good distinction. Graduate school, just read everything you can get your hands on and talk to people about everything. But I think for me, what's important about graduate school and for my students is to figure out what you love and why it matters. And that was my big thing in graduate school when I started, is we had phenomenal people come to talk to us. And my question was always like, why is what you do important? Why do you do it? What you do? And I will never forget a man who had won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, not my advisor, saying, who also won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, saying, well, I don't know, it's the only thing I'm good at. And I thought, no, I don't need a dissertation, because if that's the best you can do with 2 Pulitzer Prizes, then you got a problem. And I spent the first couple of years of graduate school figuring out why it mattered. And why was it more important that I do that than community marching in the streets? And that was not an easy answer. It took decades to figure out why I was doing those things. But I think it's completely respectable to decide that what really matters to you is, you know, the history of, you know, Imperial China, and you have found your own niche, and you're going to go ahead and do what this friend of mine calls it bricks in the wall, because that's going to matter for eternity, that you found all that stuff out. Other people can refer that, and it's good, and you've written it well enough. It doesn't have to be popular, it doesn't have to be the New York Times bestseller list. Or that you say, I'm going to take my skill set and really work on emerging markets and become a financier. That's fine too, if that's what you really care about. But if you really care about things like I do, sure, go into doing what I do. But I think it's really about where you fit into the world more than what is a good necessarily career path. Because somebody said to me once, I was saying that I had a student working in military intelligence, and we were I wasn't here. He said, do you want your students to go into the military? I said, absolutely. I want informed, able people to take their brains wherever they want to take their brains. And I'd far rather have my students in Congress or in the military or in, you know, the Groves of Gray or wherever than not. So I think the question is just figuring out what you want and what feeds your soul. And if that's the public right, if it's sitting in the basement of GovDocs reading the congressional record, which is my version of heaven, that works too.
That's a rarefied version of it.
Yeah, but you know, those were happy days.
I just have one question for you. Actually, do you think that your ability to do what you do, and I'm thinking about this with Richardson, is something that is enabled largely, on such by the internet and access to literature? So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the very fact that I can go home tonight and read everything that happened in the Senate today, right there like that, and by the way, no one reads state.gov. You know, the State Department puts everything up every day, the White House puts everything up every day, Congress puts everything up every day, the journalists who are out there burning up turf every day, and I've got it all to put my house. And you simply couldn't run that, even a decade ago, right? People were so good about it, expensive.
There are benefits to the internet.
And people can write you. People can write you and say, hey, did you see blah, blah, blah? And you'll be like, no, what was that? And a lot of what I do is just aggregate what other people do.
Your questions?
I'm a little surprised to hear you say that how similar you feel teaching to the public versus teaching in a classroom is. And I wonder if you could speak a little, you said both of you sort of that it's really the same skill set. I guess I'm curious if there aren't times when you feel that there's a tension between the need to say something in a way that will be compelling and intelligible to a much, much broader audience, and the need, your desire to say something with all the nuance that you would have said with in a classroom, or if there's ever really, if you feel that ever you can't express quite what you would want to because the audience is so broad.
Well, I'm not saying that there aren't differences, and I think you named an important one. But I guess what I try to do when I teach, and I guess this is what I try to do when I write for a column. Teaching contract law. I've got a couple of law students back there. They can tell you, I guess, whether I do this or not. But I really try to enable people to have the tools they need to understand for themselves and to make their judgments. I share what I think, but I'm trying to equip people to make decisions, to make judgments, to give them context. I'm not trying to tell them what exactly to think. So in that sense, I think what I do as a columnist often, or as in the public sphere, is a little different from being just an opinion writer, where I say, well, this is bad and bad and terrible, awful, off with their heads. I mean, you try to say, it's not that I don't think it's bad, but I try to give people, almost using somewhat low rhetoric rather than high rhetoric. Well, here's what happened. Here's how many people died. Here's what's at stake. Here's what the other argument is. And, here's what I think, So if you give people, I think teaching is enabling people to be free in some sense, and not coercing them intellectually. It's giving them those sorts of tools. And that's what I try to do when I write in a popular setting.
I would agree with that, but I would also say that I think what I do anyway, as a writer or a teacher or a columnist or anything in that one realm, is to convey ideas. And I always liken it to poetry, like you can write about butterflies as a haiku or a sonnet or a play or, an epic verse that goes on for hundreds of pages, but you're still writing about butterflies. You're just you're just directing to a different audience. And you can write to children, or you can write it to people who do nothing but specialize in butterflies. And so the idea of simply doing that, equipping people with information to be able to make decisions for themselves, you pitch it differently, but you're doing the exact same thing. And my books are exactly the same thing. We're conveying material that shapes an idea.
There's a gentleman up here.
I guess I wanted to ask a somewhat similar question, which was, given the degree of scrutiny that public figures are under now, and the amount of sort of visibility and accessibility that you have, do you feel, I guess, any sort of burden, or do you feel that sort of pressure when you write or when you communicate things to a large audience? Are you conscious of that when you formulate ideas, or when you think about how to say something, or is that not something that's...
When you say communicate ideas, you mean like who I'm communicating to or the blowback I might get?
I mean, I suppose a little bit of both. I guess on the one hand, when you're writing something that's going to be read by a large audience, do you feel a great deal of pressure to, or I guess, how does that impact how you write things? And I guess also like the fact that people will, it seems like willfully misinterpret things that
Yeah, they do.
public figures say, you know?
I mean, I don't consider myself a public figure. I've gotten involved in a couple of debates that have
Sensitive understatement. I've gotten involved in it.
that, have gotten some attention. Yeah, well, that's it. Kind of no one died, but people. You do have to develop a little bit thicker skin. People will. I mean, I've been called. Yeah. Especially if you write about anything. I mean, you do religion, and I write about religion. I've written about abortion. I've written about euthanasia. All those fun topics that nobody has an opinion on whatsoever. And so you have to, I tend to try to do it by going low rhetoric, not prophetic indictment, because that
That's what I'm
allows.
doing, but just wrote a whole book about this.
Well, there's a lot in American life. There's a real tendency to engage in prophetic indictment. Where you stand there and you castigate people. You speak truth to power, and you condemn what you think is wrong, and that's on both sides now in the culture wars. Yeah, but either side has its prophetic stance, and it condemns. That serves certain purposes, but it very often alienates people on the other side. Because if you call somebody a minion of the culture of death, or or whatever it is you're calling,
I hate them.
It isn't a name for a heavy metal band.
that would be good. It would be very good for that. And I'd even play in it, and it was probably the fact that I can't play anything wouldn't even matter. But I can. So what I try to say is, okay, here's how it looks. You don't have to agree with me. I mean, and here's why I think. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is kind of move against prophetic indictment, not because I don't think it has a place, but because I think right now it's kind of overrunning our discussion. And I think we can help if we put things in a different way, and you say, okay, here's why I think this, I understand you think differently, here's what I would say in response. So that's where I'm trying to intervene, I guess, in the terms of the stance. But you'll still get yelled at.
I can't think about the audience when I write. I have 6 friends I write to. And if anybody else wants to read it, they're welcome to. But the minute I start to think about the numbers that I'm reaching, I get completely paralyzed. So when that happens, I say I'm not ready to. I'm only ready for my 6 friends.
Heather, how many people read your book?
I have proprietary information about a lot. And I have 2 people who read for me every night. Bless their hearts, they stay up with me. And they're very funny at this point, because I will say, oh my God, this one sucks so badly. Should I just not put it out tonight? And they will say, oh, just shut up, it's good. And then of course those will be the ones that go crazy, because I just can't see it. It's good, it's not. But so I think you have to write in your vein or your goal, whatever it is, and not think about it. Because the minute you think about it, you think, oh, this person's going to react this way, and this person's going to react this way. And often you're wrong. I will write a column that I think is brilliant, and then I'll pick up my phone, and there'll be somebody I really care about going, well, you screwed that one up. And I'll think, but I wrote that one for you. You're supposed to like that one. And then the other hand, I'll think, I hope you didn't read that one. I'll get, oh, it's the best thing you ever wrote. So I think you have to divorce yourself from that. The other side of that question is, how do you deal with the reactions? You do develop a thicker skin, but you continue to develop.
Yeah, they do.
And you learn to work with police forces to protect yourself.
Oh my goodness, you're at a totally different level.
Well, just to we're in a bad moment. But people who worry, you worry because you're not in that world. Once you're in that world, it's very clear things that you do, and it's just a different world. And I have somebody who does shield me from the worst stuff that comes into the email, but even more, he shields me from the the 15 people they go, I need you to answer me right this minute. And I'm like, I would rather get a death threat than I need you to answer me right this minute because those are not serious as these are. So, so we just wanted to be part of it.
So I'm not a graduate student. I am speaking a little bit with kind of having been the career development person in my department and talking to Heather, to both of you, but specifically Heather, because academic jobs are not a given now. So now I'm not career development, I'm career diversity. So the whole point is to think about skills that are translatable, and I'm not necessarily public intellectual, but something else, right? So it's the translation that I'm very interested in, how to prepare our students to be able, so rather than kind of stick to the subject, we need them to be able to reach different audiences and different media, because now it's no longer, the print regime. So I think what Heather is describing about her capacity to get information in 2 seconds is also what is the plate tectonics that are happening, which is humanities academic jobs are no longer, they're very rare to come. So now we want our students not to be necessarily public intellectual, but to be able to speak to different people at different times and different contexts. And so,
But this speaks exactly to what somebody was saying, certainly it's been a long day out there, that what we have is a skill set to take in a lot of information and make sense of it. And then the answer to what to do with it is speaking to different audiences. What does a banker want to hear about Evergrande, about China right now? They want to know about Evergrande. And I have the skills to mine all that information about Evergrande and say, this is what matters to you. Mm-hmm. But that's not what somebody in the military wants.
Right.
And I could do that as well. And I don't mean me in particular, I mean historians can do that, or people who are trained as lawyers or whatever. And that ability to take in a lot of information, in my case, so long as it's not mathematical, and turn it into, this is what you need to know from all of this material. That's applicable to finance and to diplomacy and to governance and to journalism for sure. The only things it's not applicable to are things that are specific. Medicine jumps really to mind. Engineering, things where you need a much more specialized skill set. And so I think that what we do is incredibly widely applicable. We just have to recognize that. It's not saying I'm a specialist in 19th century American politics, but I'm a specialist in understanding and distilling and then explaining the world.
But then I think there is a challenge for grad students, and there is at least a tension in theology and philosophy where some of the people you read and some of the people you're taught to emulate do not speak with, pellucid clarity, right? If you're reading Derrida or Foucault or Judith Butler or people like this, they may have important ideas, but you don't want to start writing like them because that's going to make it harder to communicate in different ways and in different contexts. So maybe the thing is to work on, in my experience as a lawyer, in other, people want things that are clear and precise and organized. Not that you can't have complexity, but you can't fudge with big puffy words that hide something. You can only use hermeneutical once. And so I think that having students, grad students, really work on writing well. A little more Strunk and White and a little less, Gadamer.
Maybe you've already gone into this a little bit, but I'm just amazed at how you've talked about your sort of strategery around the public response. And I'm just amazed at how unfazed you both seem, to be honest, sort of psychologically. And I guess I wonder whether this has always been something true of you, if you think you're just tough individuals, or I'm serious, you might be tough individuals. Do you think that a certain sort of natural toughness is required of you? Do you think it comes with Professor Richardson, you mentioned with the kids, like experience, what with life experience. Where do you think this is sort of coming from? Because I think a lot of people who are in the public sphere do not, by the way, really as well as you do.
I think it is habituation. I remember when I started getting hate mail, and I actually have some observations about that. And the real bad stuff that comes, I was shell shocked. I remember sitting there literally like, and you do start to recognize what's real and what's not. What is a friend of mine called keyboard commandos. That it's just every one of those team and you're not a good person on the other side. So you do start to recognize that. I will also say that I'm also one in the sense that,
I don't think you are.
so I just came from doing a Facebook thing, and one of the things that the trolls do is you can see their waves, that they try different ways to stop the creation of the kind of community I'm trying to build. And today was pornography. And I didn't think anything could knock me off, but I'm talking, I can't do anything but stream pornography that's on the site. And I was like, I can't do this. I was up to 4 o'clock this morning, I've been doing email all day, my eyes are bothering me. I can't, I'm just gonna call it my phone. Excuse me. Damn it, no. Because then they will. And I finished it, but only because I like it. Whoever that expert is not gonna win. And so for me, a lot of it is just like, go ahead, try it. But it does. I mean, certainly when you get the real threats, and you'll note that if you follow me on any of my social media that has pictures or anything, I never show my children's faces. I don't identify them, they have different last names than I do. I don't say where I live, and that's not because I'm a boy, it's because it's a safety issue. And so, like I say, you learn to work around it, but we're in a cracking moment. And I will say, I asked once, we had this discussion with the journalists, male journalists, older male journalists who had been in, among other places, he'd been in the DNC in 1968 in the midst of that craziness. And he was saying something, and I said to him, have you ever gotten ahead of that? He laughed, he said, of course not. And I said, okay, I'm this many years younger than you, and I have gotten some regularity. So don't sit there and say to me, this is a safe profession. He said, what? You have? And I was like, what fun do you want? And I think that it's women being in this profession, and I think it's dismal.
And if you're, I've not encountered anything at the level that you have in terms of,
And by the way, I have had experienced nothing like Gamergate. I mean, I'm really in the realm of sort of the normal. Not but really.
Well, you've had a lot of people praying for you.
well, I've had, but that's much more like, oh, you're going to hell, and you were undermining, good teaching. You're really a bad person. So it's more along those lines that you get, because you don't agree with them. For example, I've defended Catholics voting for Biden, and we've gotten a lot of blowback on that on the abortion issue, even though I never said all Catholics had to vote for Biden. I'm just trying again to create a space where, and explaining why I thought this was the right thing to do and also legitimate according to theological principles. But you do get people who are, and so you need some friends who say, no, you're not possessed. So you have to have good friends that you can kind of, and then I think the orneriness comes in, because you say,
And you call your friends, say, Mark, am I possessed?
yeah, and he says, no, not today, Kat. So you need a kind of a support network, and you do need to say, look, I'm not going to run my life according to your principles. And they take on a certain, I don't know if you find this, they take on a certain bigger quality, because if you're an academic, the written word has a certain sanctity to it, And so if somebody sends you an email that says this, because it's in a written word, I take it more seriously than if this person appeared before me and I say, yeah, you've got some problems, bye-bye.
They wouldn't do it in person. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, no, it's true, but that's also my thing, is I love words and written words, and so if something is in a written word, or,
Although my all-time favorite is, you are dumb. I still love that. It's like, oh my God, I'm gonna quit. That was it. You are dumb.
did they spell it U and then O-U-R and then?
Exactly. It just amused me to know it. I'm like, why did you bother? Like, I don't know better than that.
So I have certain friends of more technology background, libertarian bent, who get very excited about the idea of, I would say, like, public intellectuals establishing themselves outside of academia through the power of technology to access information, self-publish, and then for networks to kind of bubble things to the top. And my internal idea of a public intellectual is someone who comes through kind of that traditional channel of establishing themselves in academia and then wading into the public square. And so I'm just curious what maybe your concerns are with that first model, and what your defense would be of the more traditional model, if that makes sense.
So you wanna know what the concerns are with the
The kind of completely wide open.
well, it's changed things, hasn't it? So like, what I say about theology is anybody, and Mark's heard this one before, anybody with an internet connection, a copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and a badass attitude thinks they're a theologian. So there is and there's a sense in which expertise, and it doesn't matter, you just, in truth doesn't matter, we've seen it. Actual evidence doesn't matter, so then can't you say, well, I matter. You have to somehow show the value that your contribution is making, because it's informed, and that's why I admire what Heather does so much, because she's actually showing how knowing a huge amount makes an enormous difference in the perspective. So you can't tell people to pay attention to, but you can show them.
I would say I have the same concerns that, anybody is an expert on anything now. But that being said, as a historian, it worries me less than it worries a lot of people, in the sense that it's just a new technology. It's the Wild West right now. We haven't figured it out yet. We will. And it's funny because somebody asked me just last night what I thought was going to happen with all those newsletters, because I alluded to it. They're not all going to stay. It's a lot of work. And if I had to guess, we're going to see the establishment of new journals, magazines, where a bunch of people come together and say, I'm not writing every night, but I'll trade with you over the next 7. And we'll get a whole new set of gatekeepers. And part of one of the issues here is they hold gatekeepers in many ways because of financial pressures they were under and other things drop the ball. And so you've got this great ferment of voices, and they're not going to stay around forever. What is more interesting to me right now in terms of the stuff you're talking about is that the issue is not the lack of expertise of the new voices. Those are actually wonderful. The issue is the artificial amplification of the disinformation of those voices. And that's not actually an intellectual issue, that's a technological issue. And that is something that obviously in America we can't go after free speech, but we absolutely could go after the algorithms that privilege the guy who threw porn on my website for an solid hour while thousands of people were trying to have a discussion on the debt ceiling, right? So that, I suspect, is going to be the next frontier where we really crack down on the admission of, the trolls and the bots that amplify disinformation. If we did that, we'd actually come a lot closer to restoring the concept of, a level playing field, so that you could sit there and say, well, she knows something about theology and she doesn't. As opposed to, she knows something about theology and I can buy, 7,500 iPhones to retweet me for $17.
Clear.
Yeah, in response to this capital M moment we're having, is there more or less utility for public intellectuals? And does the public receive intellectualism any differently? And how does that inform what we do?
That's a good one. I think that there is I'm going to make a historical judgment here, and then Heather can correct me. But I mean, I think there is an anti-intellectual strand in American life that is
You're on safe ground so far.
so, you know, and that was exacerbated, I think, in the past few years with Trump and the White House, and so that puts a certain kind of intellectual, public intellectual behind it, because, you know, you're an egghead, you know, you're just giving your own perspective on things, you're a leftist, all of those things, you know, they're attacked not for what they say, but for their stance. And so I think that that's a problem, but I think at some point, although I thought this and now I don't anymore, I thought that the COVID and the information about the vaccines and the data about how they're working and the areas, you know, which are doing badly, all of that would, you know, because it does affect life and death, that would overcome kind of the conspiracy theorists and the misinformation and that, but it hasn't necessarily. I mean, if you look at the data about who's vaccinated and who's not vaccinated, it's really interesting if you correlate it to education levels, to political stances and that. So I'm not overly hopeful that this problem is going to be solved soon.
I will say, one of the things that I find fascinating, what I'm playing with right now, is that technology has opened up, and especially COVID, has opened up an entirely new set of people who are engaged in the world in a way they've never been before. And I don't think that anybody has adequately grappled with that yet. And when I think about what the world will look like, probably not in my lifetime, but in yours, I think the academy is going to look entirely different, because right now, in history, for example, it's just ducky me teaching people in K through 16 history, but let's be real. I mean, you don't have any kind of a background to fit the history into it. I think we're going to be looking much more toward continuing ed, toward lifetime learning instead of K through 16 learning. I think we're going to be reaching into rural areas that might not otherwise have had access to people, because now you can, you know, turn on your iPad and listen to Preet Bharara talking about, you know, the Southern District of New York. And I find it frightening where we are a lot of the time. But I also feel like as I say to my students, the internet was the equivalent to the discovery of fire. And it's going to throw everything up in the air, and we don't know where it's going to land. But I think it is a huge mistake to think within the walls of the academy or within the walls of journalism or within any walls going forward, because the American population has just, I'm sorry, the Americans, the world population has just changed. And so it's a really exciting time to be playing with ideas. And yeah, you're going to have people telling you that you're going to hell. I wish, I've never had that one. How creative. Actually, it'd be fun to answer each other. Because honestly, I would say, I'll say this on fire.
But do you think that there's I mean, I sometimes wonder with the information overload, right? You know, where you know, and there's so many places you can go get things that people just say, no, not tonight. I'm just going to binge watch Ted Lasso, or you know, I mean, I'm not going to, you know, I can't make sense of the whole thing. I'm just going to go into a little world that's.
I think people do, but I also think that human beings are hardwired to learn. I mean, if we didn't keep learning, we're going to get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So the question is, what are they going to learn? And how? And how, although I think the internet has made how a little bit more obvious. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, it may not be that you want to learn about American politics, which is just fine, but so long as you have something to love, flower arranging or colors or the Chinese economy or whatever, that is an avenue into humanity, and that is, I think, a very hopeful place for us to be right now.
Please join me in thanking our tutors.